The discoveries made by archaeologists and researchers never cease to amaze us. One such discovery was when they found the charred remains of a flatbread that was presumed to be baked 14,400 years ago by hunter-gatherers in the northeastern region of Jordan at an archaeological site. And it turns out to be the most ancient evidence of bread discovered until today and dates back to at least 4,000 years before the beginning of agriculture. These findings indicate that the production of bread based on wild cereals enabled hunter-gatherers to cultivate cereals, thus contributing to the Neolithic agricultural revolution. Hello and welcome back to the Abandoned Archaeologist again, the channel to learn all about ancient archaeological findings. Today we'll discuss the discovery of a 14,400-year-old flatbread found in Jordan, defining human history again. So what shocked the archaeologists and how will it be a game changer? Here we begin with the video. What about the hunter-gatherer culture? Hunter-gatherer culture is a subsistence lifestyle that relies on hunting and fishing animals for food and foraging for wild vegetation and other nutrients such as honey. Until about 12,000 years ago, all humans hunted and gathered food. Anthropologists have discovered evidence from modern humans or Homo sapiens and their distant ancestors engaging in hunter-gatherer culture dating back 2 million years. Before the appearance of hunter-gatherer cultures, earlier groups relied on scavenging animal remains left behind by predators. Because hunter-gatherers did not rely on agriculture for survival, they relied on mobility. Indeed, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle necessitated access to large areas of land, ranging from 7 to 500 square miles, to find the food they required to survive. Because of this, long-term settlements were impractical, and most hunter-gatherers were nomadic. As a result, hunter-gatherer bands typically ranged in size from an extended family to a small band of no more than 100 people. When agricultural practices were first developed thousands of years ago, some groups extorted the hunter-gatherer practices to establish permanent settlements supporting much larger populations. Many hunter-gatherer behaviors, however, persisted until the modern era. There were still some hunter-gatherers in parts of Europe and the Americas as recently as 1500 CE. The population of hunter-gatherers has declined dramatically over the last 500 years. Today, only a few remain, with the Hadza people from Tanzania being one of the last to practice this tradition. Despite being one of the most important foods consumed in modern times, the origins of bread remain largely unknown, and the presentation of one of the oldest pieces of empirical evidence for Natufian hunter-gatherers preparing bread-like products 4,000 years before the Neolithic agricultural way of life sheds light on a dynamic new discovery that changes what we know of its initial origins. A team of researchers examined charred food remains from a 14,400-year-old Natufian hunter-gatherer site known as Shaboika 1 in Jordan's Black Desert. Surprisingly, archaeologists stated that the discovery of hundreds of charred food remains in the fireplaces of Shabukia 1 is a remarkable find that has allowed us to characterize 14,000-year-old food practices. The 24 remains examined in the study show that wild ancestors of domesticated cereals like barley, einkorn, and oat were ground, sieved, and kneaded before cooking. The relics resemble unleavened flatbreads discovered at several Neolithic and Roman sites in Europe and Turkey. As a result, they now knew that flatbread products existed long before farming. The next step is to see if the production and consumption of bread had any impact on the emergence of plant cultivation and domestication. They were particularly interested in Natufian hunter-gatherers because they lived during a transitional period when people got highly sedentary and their diets started to change. In addition, flint sickle blades and ground stone tools discovered at Natufian sites in the Levant have long led archaeologists to believe that people began to exploit plants in a new and possibly more effective way. However, the flatbread discovered at Shaboika 1 is the one and foremost evidence of bread making recovered thus far, indicating that baking was invented before plant cultivation. As a result, this evidence supports some of our hypotheses. Indeed, it is possible that the early and time-consuming production of bread from wild cereals was one of the primary driving forces behind the later agricultural revolution, in which wild cereals were cultivated to provide more convenient food sources. The identification of prehistoric bread under a microscope. PhD candidate Laura Gonzalez Carretero, UCL Institute of Archaeology, an expert on prehistoric bread, examined the charred food remains with electronic microscopy in a University College London lab. In archaeology, identifying bread or other cereal-based products is difficult. There's been a trend towards simplifying classification without thoroughly testing it against identification criteria. We developed new criteria for identifying flatbread, dough, and porridge-like products in the archaeological record. They identified the microstructures and particles of each charred food that remained using scanning electron microscopy. Bread requires labor-intensive processing, such as dehusking, cereal grinding, kneading, and baking. The fact that it was produced before farming methods suggests that it was considered special, and the desire to produce more of this special food most likely contributed to the decision to begin cultivating cereals. This depends on new methodological developments that allow us to identify bread remnants from very small charred fragments using high magnification. There has been a tendency to use modern culinary terms to refer to ancient cereal-based products such as bread, often without testing identification criteria, and instead of cataloging them based on the presence of cereal tissue and the overall shape of the remains. Recently, detailed tissue analysis of experimental cereal-based preparations enabled the development of new criteria for identifying flatbread, dough, and porridge-like products in the archaeological record. Occluded gas cells of 0.01 to 0.1 millimeters form in the dough after mixing flour and water. Dough molding changes the gas cell structures by causing small air bubbles to burst, collide, and combine into larger ones. When this dough is charred directly, it reveals a hollow matrix with largely closed voids covering more than 30% of the surface. The most noticeable change in the microstructure of the dough occurs during baking, when gas cells expand into an open network of pores or voids. If the dough is cooked into flatbread and then charred, the matrix contains a low proportion of small micropores that cover 5 to 10% of the surface. Well, before we move ahead, we have a question you can answer at the end of the video. What did hunter-gatherers depend on? Write down your answer in the comment section and see if you got it right. Moving on. A total of 24 food remains were classified as bread-like products at Shubaika 1, based on the estimation, quantification, measurement, and typological classification of visible plant particles and voids in the food matrix. Around 22 of these were discovered in the oldest fireplace and 2 in the youngest. All fragments had a starchy, often vitrified microstructure and an irregular porous matrix, indicating that they were well-processed food components. The average size of the remains was 4.4 millimeters wide, 2.5 millimeters tall, and 5.7 millimeters long. Because their height was 25 millimeters, the basic classification system based on height measurements suggests that they most likely represent unleavened flatbread-like products. In modern leavened bread, voids are typically less than 1 millimeter in size and cover 40 to 70% of the matrix. The average size of the voids in the bread-like remains from Shubaika 1 was 0.15 millimeters, making up 16% of the matrix. These findings are consistent with flatbread finds from several Neolithic and Roman age sites in Europe and Turkey. Prehistoric food practices are still being studied. A grant recently awarded to a team from the University of Copenhagen will ensure the continuation of research into food production during the Neolithic transition. The Danish Council for Independent Research recently approved additional funding for the research, allowing them to dig deeper into how people consumed various plants and animals. For example, building on the research into early bread will give them a better understanding of why certain ingredients were preferred over others and eventually selected for cultivation in the future. The Independent Research Fund Denmark provided funding for the Shubaika project research. Jordan's Department of Antiquities granted permission to excavate. This is the end of today's video, and the answer to the question we've asked is that hunter-gatherers led subsistence lifestyles that rely on hunting and fishing animals while foraging for wild vegetation and other nutrients like honey for food. Surprising, right? Well, stay tuned for more discoveries.